My wife's family laughed when I lost my job. We always knew he was a loser. She joined in, I smiled, said nothing, and started building my business in secret. Yesterday, her father's company filed for bankruptcy. I always knew my in-laws tolerated me at best. For 6 years, I've swallowed their backhanded compliments and subtle digs about my background. Vernon, my father-in-law, never let me forget that he gave me a chance at his company when no one else would. Let that sink in. The man had been rewriting my history since day one, convincing everyone, including my wife, that I was some charity case he rescued. Maybe I let it happen. I smiled through the weekly family dinners, where I was the perpetual punchline. I nodded when Vernon interrupted my presentations to correct me in front of the entire executive team. I looked the other way when he took credit for my financial strategy that saved the company millions. Here's the thing about being underestimated. People get careless around you. They speak freely. They leave sensitive documents unattended. They forget you understand exactly what they're doing. Last Monday started like any other. I had just finished the quarterly financial projection. Ahead of schedule, as usual. Vernon called me into the conference room. I thought maybe, finally, he'd acknowledge my work. Honestly, what an idiot I was. The room was packed, not just with executives, but with people from departments that had no business being there. Vernon had gathered an audience. The minute I walked in and saw his smirk, I knew. This was theater, and I was about to become the entertainment. He didn't even offer me a seat. Right there, standing like a schoolboy being disciplined, he informed me that due to restructuring, they were eliminating my position. He went on, loudly, about how the company needed someone with actual qualifications and leadership potential. The room was dead silent except for a few barely suppressed chuckles. 6 years of my life, dismissed in 3 minutes of carefully crafted humiliation. I kept my face completely neutral as Vernon actually held out his hand for me to shake, as if he deserved my gratitude for the public execution. I shook it. What else could I do? Security was already waiting to escort me out. I wasn't allowed to return to my desk. Everything would be shipped to me. 6 years, and I couldn't even say goodbye to the few colleagues I respected. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing between panic about our mortgage and the realization that Vernon had been planning this for weeks. Why else bring in people from every department to witness my dismissal? The most devastating part? I had to tell Milana. When we first met, Milana seemed different from her family. Warmer, more genuine, but 5 years of marriage had slowly revealed the truth. The apple never falls far from the tree. Still, I hoped, stupidly, that in this moment she'd choose me over her family's narrative. I barely finished explaining what happened when she was already on the phone with her mother, not comforting me, not assuring me we'd figure it out together. No, her first instinct was to inform her family that their assessment of me had finally been proven correct. I sat there, listening to her describe my firing as if it were an inevitable conclusion everyone had seen coming. Everyone except foolish, delusional me. The dinner invitation came within the hour. Vernon and Edith insisted we come over that night to discuss next steps. Milana didn't even ask if I was up for it. Of course we were going. Her father would fix this somehow. Maybe he'd find me something more suitable to my abilities. The condescension in her voice made my stomach turn. Their house has always intimidated me. A sprawling monument to Vernon's success, with photos of him shaking hands with local celebrities and politicians lining the entryway. That night, it felt like walking into a lion's den. Vernon already had drinks poured when we arrived. Not the good scotch he served guests he respected. No, he'd poured me the cheap stuff he kept for service people. Another small humiliation he thought I wouldn't notice. The next 2 hours were the most degrading of my life. With each drink, they became bolder. Vernon launched into stories about how he took a chance on me despite his reservations about my potential. Edith reminisced about warning Milana not to settle for someone with my background. Milana's brother Sidney joked about starting a betting pool years ago about how long I'd last at the company. And Milana, my wife, she laughed along, occasionally patting my hand with performative sympathy while joining their chorus. At one point, She actually said that at least now I could find something more my speed, as if I had been playing out of my league all along. I just sat there, a frozen smile on my face, nodding occasionally. Inside, something was crystallizing, a cold clarity I'd never experienced before. I realized I'd spent years making myself smaller to fit their perception. For what? For the privilege of being their punching bag? When Vernon proposed a toast to new beginnings, his euphemism for my failure, something inside me shifted permanently. As everyone clinked glasses, laughing at the latest joke at my expense, I made a decision. I would no longer react. I would no longer defend myself. I would simply observe and remember every slight, every laugh, every dismissive glance, because here's what they didn't know. During my time at Vernon's company, I had discovered things, inconsistencies in the books, safety reports that had been doctored, bids that had been won through unexplained consulting fees to government officials relative, little breadcrumbs that, if followed diligently, painted a picture of a business built on fraud and corruption. I had documented everything, not with any purpose initially, just because that's who I am. Methodical, thorough, the boring qualities they always mocked. For years, I'd been Vernon's unofficial confidant, simply because he didn't consider me important enough to be a threat. The things he'd say in front of me, assuming I was too scared or too stupid to understand their implications. That night, driving home in silence while Milana texted her friends about my unemployment, I began mentally cataloging every document I had, every conversation I'd witnessed, every illegal shortcut Vernon had bragged about. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I had the skeleton of a plan. The next morning, I was up before dawn. While Milana slept, I transferred all our joint savings into my personal account, money I had primarily contributed anyway, just a precaution. Then I made a call to Sergio, Vernon's former partner whom he'd forced out years ago. The man had always been kind to me, recognizing my skills even when Vernon diminished them. We arranged to meet for coffee. Over the next week, I played the part they expected, defeated husband diligently applying for jobs, gratefully receiving Vernon's advice, nodding along as Milana and her mother discussed how we'd need to adjust our lifestyle while shopping for new designer purses. But every night, after Milana fell asleep, I was building something. Starting with the information I had and Sergio's industry connections, I was creating the foundation for Vernon's destruction. Not just his business, his entire life, his reputation, his standing in the community, his relationship with his precious daughter. It's been 3 weeks now. Vernon believes I spend my days sending out resumes and wallowing in rejection. Milana thinks I'm at the library using their computers for job searches because we need to save on electricity. Neither suspects I've rented a small office across town where I'm meticulously building a case that will bring everything Vernon values crashing down around him. Yesterday, I sent my first anonymous tip to the regulatory board about safety violations on Vernon's current major project. It's just the first thread, but when pulled, the entire tapestry of his success will unravel. The man who has spent years calling me weak, unambitious, and incompetent has no idea that I'm dismantling his life piece by calculated piece. And when I'm done, when he's standing in the ruins of everything he built, I'll finally speak, and he'll finally listen. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I'm serving it frozen. Update. It's been exactly 6 months since that humiliating dinner where my wife and her family laughed at my unemployment. 6 months of living a double life that not even the most perceptive member of my wife's family has noticed. Funny thing is, they've been so convinced of my incompetence for so long that it never occurs to them I could be behind their mounting problems. The first sign that my plan was working came 3 weeks after I sent those anonymous tips about safety violations. I was sitting across from Vernon at another excruciating Sunday dinner when his phone kept buzzing. Each time he checked it, his face grew a shade darker. By dessert, he was barely touching his food, something I'd never seen before. The man usually eats like every meal is his last. Later that night, Milana casually mentioned that her father was dealing with some ridiculous inspection at his biggest project site. Apparently, Someone had reported multiple safety violations, and now the whole site was shut down pending a full review. The financial hit was already in the hundreds of thousands. I nodded sympathetically while feeling the first real satisfaction I'd experienced in years. That was just the beginning. The safety violations were a thread. Once pulled, the entire tapestry began to unravel. The inspectors found enough problems to trigger a company-wide audit. What they discovered led to fines that Vernon couldn't easily absorb, especially with his major projects on hold. Meanwhile, I continued playing the defeated husband. Every morning I'd dress in increasingly shabby clothes, a calculated touch, kiss Milana goodbye, and pretend to head out for another day of fruitless job hunting. In reality, I'd go to my small office across town, where Sergio and I were building our shadow operation. Sergio had been waiting years for this opportunity. Vernon had forced him out of their partnership through some creative accounting and fabricated allegations. The man had documentation of Vernon's questionable business practices going back 15 years. Documentation that, combined with my insider knowledge, created a devastating arsenal. By month 3, we had anonymously contacted 7 of Vernon's key employees with carefully selected evidence of his illegal practices. We offered them immunity and future positions if they provided additional documentation. 5 agreed immediately. Vernon's most trusted project manager was the first to resign, followed quickly by his senior estimator and lead superintendent. Within 2 weeks, the exodus was making waves throughout the industry. The morning his controller quit, Vernon showed up at our house unannounced. I was thankfully already gone to my job search, but Milana recounted his visit that evening. Apparently, he'd been ranting about competitors sabotaging him and ungrateful employees stabbing him in the back. The great Vernon, who'd built his empire through hard work and integrity, couldn't comprehend that his own actions had created enemies capable of bringing him down. Here's the thing about men like Vernon. They believed their own myths. He genuinely couldn't see that his success was built on exploitation, fraud, and intimidation. He thought he was untouchable. That blind spot made my work so much easier. Month 4 brought the anonymous industry newsletter. Using information from Vernon's former employees, I created a detailed analysis of his company's problems, pending legal issues, and financial instability. I distributed it to every client and potential client in his database. The cancellations started rolling in within days. Watching Vernon's unraveling through Milana's updates became my evening entertainment. She'd pace our living room, increasingly agitated, as she relayed her father's latest setbacks. The country club membership he could no longer afford. The vacation home being quietly listed for sale. The staff at their main house reduced to just a weekly cleaning service. My wife's attitude toward me began shifting too. Where once there was contempt, now there was calculation. She stopped buying designer clothes. She started suggesting budget-friendly date nights. She even hinted that perhaps I should consider any job, even something basic, to help with our finances. The woman who laughed when her father called me a loser was now worried about making mortgage payments. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Month 5 was when I delivered the killing blow. Using the financial evidence Sergio and I had meticulously compiled, I triggered a comprehensive tax audit of Vernon's business and personal accounts. The man had been evading taxes for over a decade, using offshore accounts and phantom expenses to hide millions. Now, those chickens were coming home to roost. The night Vernon received the audit notice, Milana got a hysterical call from her mother. I could hear Edith's shrill voice through the phone from across the room. Vernon had apparently thrown a crystal decanter through his office window and was refusing to speak to anyone. Milana left immediately to help calm things down. She didn't return until the next morning, looking exhausted and frightened. That's when she finally told me the truth about their financial situation. Vernon's company was hemorrhaging money. Multiple projects were stalled. Clients were demanding refunds of deposit. Suppliers were requiring cash on delivery after hearing rumors of insolvency. The family home had a second mortgage now. Edith's jewelry was quietly being sold off piece by piece. And still, Not once did any of them suspect me. In their minds, I remained the pathetic son-in-law who couldn't even find entry-level work. The man so incompetent that, 6 months after being fired, he still had no prospects. Every time Milana looked at me with that mixture of pity and resentment, I had to suppress a smile. While Vernon's company was collapsing, Sergio and I were building its replacement. Using our network of his former employees, we had created a lean operation specifically designed to take over Vernon's market share. We secured financing based on the projects we knew would soon need new contractors. We established relationships with the suppliers who were getting nervous about Vernon's credit. We positioned ourselves as the stable, ethical alternative to Vernon's failing empire, all without my name appearing on a single document. On paper, I was still unemployed. In reality, I was about to become Vernon's direct competitor and his replacement. Last week brought the moment I'd been waiting for. Vernon's largest lender, acting on information they'd received from an industry source, me, called in their loans due to covenant violation. With no cash reserves left and his personal assets already leveraged to keep the business afloat, Vernon had no choice but to liquidate major assets at fire sale prices. The family's vacation property went first, sold for 60% of its value to meet immediate obligations. Then their boat, then their cars. Milana came home in tears the day her mother called to say they were letting go of their country club membership. Not because they couldn't afford the dues, but because Vernon couldn't bear facing the other members now that rumors about his business were circulating. The social humiliation was hitting him harder than the financial losses. The man built his identity around being the successful titan everyone admired and envied. Now, he was becoming a cautionary tale. Yesterday marked the culmination of 6 months of careful planning. Vernon's company officially filed for bankruptcy protection. The news spread through the industry like wildfire. Milana was inconsolable, not just for her father but for what it meant for our future. With her family's support system collapsing, she suddenly saw me, still unemployed, still struggling, as her only safety net. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who joined her family in mocking my failure was now desperately hoping I'd find a way to support her. This morning I noticed something different in Milana's behavior. She made me breakfast, something she hasn't done since the early days of our marriage. She suggested that perhaps I could help at her father's company, now that they were restructuring. Perhaps I could prove myself during this difficult time. I smiled and nodded, just as I've been doing for months. But inside, I was laughing. Vernon's company won't be restructuring. It will be liquidated, piece by piece. And who will be there to pick up those pieces at pennies on the dollar? The shadow company Sergio and I created specifically for this purpose. Tonight is the emergency family meeting Vernon has called to discuss their financial future. He's insisting I attend, probably to serve as the scapegoat for all their problems. Little does he know, I've been waiting for precisely this moment. The moment when they're all gathered, vulnerable and desperate. The moment when I finally reveal that the man they underestimated, humiliated, and discarded has engineered their complete destruction. For 6 months, I've been the puppet master, pulling strings they didn't even know existed. Tonight, they'll see those strings for the first time. Tonight, the real destruction begins. Because while Vernon was so busy laughing at my failure, he failed to notice I was memorizing the blueprint of his success and all the shortcuts, frauds, and vulnerabilities that made it possible. I didn't just want his company to fail. I wanted him to know with absolute certainty that I was the architect of his downfall. By this time tomorrow, nothing in our lives will be the same, and I can't wait. Update 2. I arrived at Vernon's house exactly 20 minutes late for the emergency family meeting. A calculated move. I wanted them waiting, growing increasingly agitated. The house looked different now, the lights dimmer, the landscaping neglected. Amazing how quickly the appearance of wealth fades when the money stops flowing. Vernon opened the door himself. No housekeeper anymore. His face had aged years in just months. Deep lines around his mouth, dark circles under bloodshot eyes. He barely acknowledged me as I stepped inside. Funny considering I was the reason for his current state. The family had gathered in the living room. The same room where, 6 months ago, they'd laughed at my unemployment and toasted to my failure. Now they sat in tense silence, Edith, her jewelry noticeably downgraded, Sidney missing his usual smug smile. Milana, who'd been unusually attentive to me lately, positioned herself between her father and me. Protecting him or me? I wondered. Vernon didn't waste time. The company was officially bankrupt. The family home would be sold. Their savings were depleted from trying to keep the business afloat. They needed to consolidate resources and consider their options. The great Vernon reduced to euphemisms for poverty. Throughout his monologue, I maintained the same frozen smile I'd perfected over months of their mockery, just nodding occasionally, playing the dutiful son-in-law who still somehow didn't understand the gravity of the situation. Inside, I was cataloging every detail of their distress: Vernon's trembling hands, Edith's red-rimmed eyes, Sidney's defeated posture. I wanted to remember this moment perfectly. Then came the proposal. Vernon, in his desperation, suggested I take a position at what remained of his company. He'd heard through Milana that I'd been networking during my unemployment. Perhaps my connections could help rebuild. I nearly laughed aloud at the irony. The man was asking for help from the architect of his destruction. That's when I decided it was time. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. Nothing dramatic, just a standard manila folder containing documents that would shatter what remained of their world. I started by asking Vernon if he remembered the day he fired me. Specifically, if he recalled having the entire executive team present to witness my humiliation. His expression shifted slightly, confusion mixed with irritation at the irrelevant question. I didn't wait for an acknowledgement. I simply opened the folder and slid the first document across the coffee table toward him. It was the incorporation papers for my company, dated just 3 days after my termination. The company that had been systematically acquiring Vernon's clients, hiring his employees, and now stood poised to purchase his assets at bankruptcy auction. The silence in the room deepened as Vernon stared at the document, his mind working to process what he was seeing. Before he could speak, I slid the second document toward him, a list of his former clients who had signed contracts with my company over the past 6 months. One by one, I presented the evidence of my methodical destruction of everything Vernon had built. The anonymous safety complaints that triggered the initial inspections, the tax audit that exposed years of fraud, the industry newsletter that destroyed his credibility with clients, all traced back to me. With each revelation, Vernon's face contorted further. Rage, disbelief, then something I'd never seen before. Fear. Actual fear as he realized what I'd done, what I was still doing. When I finally explained how I'd partnered with Sergio, the former partner Vernon had screwed over years ago, Vernon actually lunged across the table at me. Sidney held him back, but just barely. The great Vernon reduced to impotent rage in his own living room. Milana's reaction was almost worth the entire 6 months of planning. First denial, then anger directed at me, then a devastating realization as she processed what this meant for her future. The woman who had joined her family in mocking me was now facing the collapse of her carefully constructed world. I saved the most devastating blow for last. I slid the final document across the table, my offer to purchase Vernon's company assets at the bankruptcy auction. An offer far below market value, but likely the only offer that would materialize given the company's tainted reputation. An offer that, if accepted, would give me control of everything Vernon had spent his life building. Then I stood up and told them exactly what would happen next. Vernon would be facing criminal charges for tax evasion and safety violation. I'd made sure the evidence was irrefutable. The family home and remaining assets would be seized. Vernon's reputation in the industry was already destroyed beyond repair. No one would hire him, partner with him, or even associate with him professionally. Edith interrupted then, demanding to know why I would do this to them, as if she'd forgotten the years of humiliation, the mockery, the constant undermining. I reminded her of that dinner 6 months ago, how they'd laughed at my misfortune, how they'd treated me like garbage throughout my marriage to their daughter, how they'd never once shown me basic human respect. The room fell silent again. the weight of their own actions finally settling on. Milana tried a different approach. Through tears, she claimed she'd always loved me, had only gone along with her family's behavior to please them. She reached for my hand, promising we could start fresh, build something together. I let her hold my hand for exactly 3 seconds before pulling away and placing the divorce papers on the table. Her name already filled out, just waiting for her signature. Her face crumpled as she realized there would be no reconciliation, no financial rescue from her husband. Vernon made one last desperate attempt. He threatened to expose me, to tell everyone how I deliberately targeted his company. I just smiled and slid another document across the table. Detailed records of his fraudulent business practices going back 15 years. Records that would ensure any accusation he made against me would only result in further investigation of his own crime. That's when Vernon broke. Not with a dramatic outburst, but with a quiet deflation that was somehow more satisfying. The man who had seemed larger than life, who had made me feel small at every opportunity, literally shrank before my eyes. Shoulders slumped, head bowed, utterly defeated. I left them there, surrounded by the evidence of their downfall and my revenge. As I walked out, I heard Edith begin to sob, Sydney cursing under his breath, Milana calling my name. I didn't look back. The next week passed in a blur of legal proceeding. As expected, my company's bid for Vernon's assets was accepted. No one else wanted to touch a business with such toxic associations. The poetic justice of signing those acquisition papers, of legally taking ownership of everything Vernon had built, was indescribable. Vernon himself wasn't present for the proceedings. He'd been arrested 3 days after our meeting, led away in handcuffs from his country club, where he'd gone to drown his sorrows. The charges were extensive: tax fraud, safety violations, bribery of officials. His lawyer was already floating a plea deal, but even best-case scenario, Vernon would serve time. Edith filed for divorce the day after Vernon's arrest, a transparent attempt to protect what assets she could. Too late. The financial investigation had already frozen their accounts and flagged transfers made over the past year. She was left with virtually nothing except what she could get for her remaining jewelry. As for Milana, she refused to sign the divorce papers initially, kept showing up at our house, alternating between tears and rage, begging for another chance, then cursing me for destroying her family. I simply had the locks changed and her belongings packed and stored. Eventually, when she realized I'd also frozen our joint accounts and she had no access to funds, she signed. The industry response was exactly as I'd anticipated. No one publicly connected me to Vernon's downfall. I'd been careful to maintain plausible deniability. Instead, I was viewed as the savvy businessman who recognized an opportunity in the chaos, the former employee who'd gone on to greater success. Several of Vernon's former associates even reached out to congratulate me on my acquisition, eager to establish relationships with the new blood in the industry. Sergio and I moved quickly to stabilize the business, retaining the employees who'd been unknowing pawns in Vernon's schemes while implementing legitimate practices. We rebranded, of course. No sense in carrying forward a name tainted by scandal. Within a month, we'd secured contracts with former clients who'd fled Vernon's company but still needed their projects completed. This morning brought news that Vernon's sentencing is scheduled for next week. His lawyer is pushing for leniency based on his age and contributions to the community. Given the extent of his crimes, he's still looking at a minimum of 5 years. 5 years for the man who thought he was untouchable. 5 years for the man who mocked me in front of his entire company. Justice has a certain symmetry sometimes. Milana texted yesterday. She's moved in with a friend, looking for work for the first time in her life. Her message included phrases like, "I never meant to hurt you," and "We can still work this out." I didn't respond. There's nothing left to say. Sometimes I think about that family dinner 6 months ago, Vernon raising his glass in a mocking toast to my unemployment, Edith suggesting I try work more suited to my abilities, Sydney smirking as he suggested a betting pool on how long I'd survive without Vernon's charity, Milana patting my hand with fake sympathy while joining their laughter. They're not laughing anymore. Last week, I visited Vernon's former office, my office now, sat in his chair, looked out over the view he'd so proudly showcased to visitors. I had his pretentious motivational posters taken down, replaced with modern art, had his desk removed in favor of something less ostentatious. Small changes that symbolize the larger transformation. The company is already more profitable under my leadership than it ever was under Vernon's. Turns out, ethical business practices and treating employees with respect creates loyalty and productivity. Who would have thought? Yesterday, I received a letter from Vernon's attorney written on his behalf, a rambling mixture of accusations and pleas, claiming I'd orchestrated his downfall out of spite, begging me to speak to the judge on his behalf, offering to make amends if I would help reduce his sentence. I shredded it without responding. Some might call my revenge excessive, disproportionate to the offense, but those people weren't there for years of subtle degradation. They didn't sit at that dinner table while an entire family mocked their misfortune. They didn't watch their spouse join in the humiliation instead of defending them. I didn't just want Vernon to fail. I wanted him to know that I, the man he underestimated, mocked, and discarded, was the architect of his destruction. I wanted him to live with that knowledge through every day of his imprisonment, through every night in his cell. I wanted that knowledge to be the first thing he thinks about when he wakes and the last thing before he sleeps. And now, as I sit in my new corner office, running the company that was once his pride and joy, I can finally say, it's done. The man who laughed at my unemployment will spend years in prison. The family that mocked me has been scattered and humbled. The wife who betrayed me is left with nothing but regrets. As for me, I'm just getting started. Turns out I wasn't the loser they thought I was. Not even close.